much, Z. Of why we thought about this session when we were planning the Learning Festival. So it is very, I mean, you already know that we are called Youth by Youth, and we always make efforts to actually, like, connect young people with resources. And we've seen a lot of divide, in the philanthropic space and funding space, especially with reaching out to young people. I myself last year was opportunity to be at a conference or with funders, and I realized the large divide on bridging, and I feel like it was important for us to begin to bridge that gap and create intergenerational spaces for young people and adult allies in the philanthropic space to meet and collaborate and weave projects and programs together. So in the search of that, Valentina and Zina probably met Nathan earlier in their journey at some point, most likely, especially. And then I got to meet Nathan, and since then they have been Nathan works with Porticus, and they're really thinking about this intergenerational collaboration in philanthropy and how to create sustainable solutions with young people and for young people. So without taking much of our time, I would like to invite Nathan, who is going to be the moderator for this session, to take us on the journey and introduce like other panelists and guests. So over to you, Nathan. So good to have you.
Thank you, Eri. Thanks for inviting me as well. Yeah, it's just I was sitting in on the previous sessions, and it's been brilliant, and I really appreciate being a part of it. I feel really lucky to be able to introduce Gail and Remy. That what Eri just described, that kind of role of weaving together young people, philanthropy, breaking down those barriers that exist. What we have today, two people who've been doing this for many years already. Gail is an experienced teacher in schools and universities and many other settings, and she's most recently the co-founder of Little Big Fund that supports various activists and social impact leaders around the world. Remy has worked for over a decade working alongside young people who are working for change and involved in organizational transformation and collaborative leadership. So there's a wealth of experience between the two of them. What we'll do is that we'll hear from both of them for about 25 minutes in a kind of a conversation, and then we'll take questions from everybody else in the room, and I'll just basically try and group those questions together and throw them back to Remy and Gail. As Eri said, like, this is why does this topic matter? As I see it, like, philanthropy has so much potential. Where there's financial assets, but there's freedom within philanthropy to use those assets in so many different ways. But is that philanthropic sector exercising the fullness of its freedom? I think we all would see the answer is no. There are so many self-imposed limits or restrictions that boundaries that come up. So we're going to try and poke around a bit that today to try to explore what those boundaries are, what it could look like if they didn't exist, and try to reimagine what this could look like together. So Remy, Gail, thank you so much for being here. I think we're going to spotlight the two of you for this conversation. Maybe to kick off with the two of you, where are you and how are you both today? Remy, where and how are you?
Hi, Nathan. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, clearly.
I guess not. Okay, so I'm currently in Sierra Leone. I'm in the office of one of our partners, Children's Forum Network, and there is a lot of noise around me. I just arrived in Sierra Leone about an hour ago, and yeah, that's where I am. I'm a little bit cool, calm, but anxious at the same time because it's been a long day.
Well, thanks for joining us. I know you were traveling this afternoon as well. And Gail, what about you? How are you and where are you right now?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you. I'm in Colorado, and I'm looking out the window at some white snow, but it's lit up by the bright sunshine, and I'm feeling very excited to be here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, let's start by basically naming the problem that young people are not at the center of most philanthropic work and philanthropic decisions. But why do you think that is? And Gail, if I can ask you to kick off with that, why do you think that the situation is as it is at the moment?
Oh my gosh, it's such an important and interesting and complex question. And when I read the question ahead of time, I was struck by the word center. And I thought that I had to just step back for a minute and say, well, how do I, in my generation, define centering? And so I think that one of the reasons for me, in my experience, that young people are not centered is because generations describe words differently. We have a different way of defining what the center of something is. And I think that it's important for generations to get together and talk about their jargon and talk about their assumptions about what a particular word means, because language leads us into relationships, into building relationships. And so I wish that there were many more spaces like this where there could be poetry. I think I saw that when I first entered early on to this Zoom, but there could be a breakdown of just systemic language. I think that needs to happen. The way that I, as a senior citizen, shall we say, use the internet, use language, use words to talk about wealth, to talk about money, to talk about service, all of that could be dismantled, even at an initial stage, to see how we have a shared language in the middle.
Thanks, Gail. Remy, what about you? Where do you see the roots of these problems coming from?
I think understanding the purpose of philanthropy first is where we start. And I think that when we are clear on why philanthropy exists and how can we work on ending philanthropy, maybe that's where we should start the conversation. And for me, I believe that when we talk about a lot of the issues that philanthropy is trying to solve, it all stems from young people. The roots of all of those issues is what happens at the age when people mature from being children to becoming adults. And if we are able to empower people at that age, then maybe we can create a generation of people who will not need philanthropy. So I think maybe the sense has always been there, but somehow we lost that in the transition of how philanthropy has evolved.
Thank you, Remy. Remy, your sound right towards the end was tailing off a little bit, and we lost. I caught it, but I think we were losing it a little bit. But Gail, do you want to pick up on that idea that philanthropy somehow lost its way, and you were kind of touching on something similar with like the jargon that builds up around it as well? Like...
Yes, I do think that would be a term that a group together could start to unpack. I find that I learn so much when I am in conversation with young people about their history of philanthropy, what it looks like from their perspective versus, let's say, from mine or my country's. So I think, and perhaps in the exploration of that word and that concept, there could be new definitions that could come up together that are collaborative. And I think also that the term has lost its way because of just the entrenchment that an older generation has built around the word. It has come from a colonialism base. It's like it just all needs to be dismantled. And unfortunately, there are still some people of an older generation who are holding on to an older definition and the older parts of it. Yeah.
Remy, do you want to jump in and respond to that? How? Go on.
Absolutely, I absolutely
Yes.
agree with that. Yes, there may be some older generation that hold on to a rather different perspective of philanthropy and meaning of the word, and I think that's where the responsibility comes in. How do we create more spaces where the misunderstanding of the meaning of these words and how the perspective might be different? That is also something to explore. I also think that in my African origin, philanthropy has always been part of Africa. It has always been part of our nature to want to share with the next person and to contribute our resources to support everyone that needs support. Philanthropy has always been in African culture in a way that they say it takes a village to raise a child, and that's literally how it is in Africa. people come together and contribute everything that they can when someone has a problem. And even when there's a celebration, everyone comes together to celebrate. And so I think for us Africans, it's taken a step back to really understand where we come from and bring in the older generations or the older generations before them as well to sit together and learn and interact with one another. Oh yes, I'm Nigerian too.
And I would just then add on to that, you know, in the process, creating a space, right, that feels that it's got the languages, not only of the words themselves, but the languages of pace, the languages of how we do things. I would venture to say that there's many older people who might be a little slower on the internet, or they might be a little slower on you know, how to use all the devices here. And I have found that in my work with younger people and in the philanthropy space, I've really been grateful for the patience that some of the ways and the pace of communicating, right, through WhatsApp or what, I've really learned a lot from that, but I've also really been grateful for the patience that it takes. It's like when someone said, what would the room look like? Right? Well, the room could also be metaphorically, let's say, designed to know that somebody might be walking in really quick on their phone, and somebody might be walking slowly with you know, with no devices in their hands. And that's how we create a space together, just using that as a symbol of space and centeredness.
And
Go on, Ravi, please.
I love that so much. You know, I had a conversation with my dad a few weeks ago when I was in Nigeria. And the conversation summarized is, when I was young, he always used to nag at me for always being on my phone. Now he's doing the same thing. And we tend to think that the older generation always slow with technology, but I find that there are so many young people who are slower than the older ones, actually. And it could happen with differences, you know, there could be, it doesn't matter what the age is. Yes, tendency is that because the generation might be older, they might be slower to technology, but the more we have intergenerational education and engagement and discussions, we find that may not exactly always be that case. There are a lot of young people who could learn learn about technology from the older generation. And there are a lot of older people who could learn from the younger. So I think that's what the room would look like, as you said. You know, some people might be working fast paced, they might be older. Some people might be working very slowly and not have any phones in hands, but they might be younger.
But both of you, when I was speaking to you earlier this week, both of you shared examples of ways in which you'd supported people kind of to overcome some of those blockages that philanthropy puts up, like Gail, you touched on like the jargon, and both of you mentioned that kind of the lack of those spaces. Could you talk through a little bit, like what's your not your like your top bit of advice, but what's been the kind of, if you think of your experiences over those years, what's been something that really stands out for you in terms of what worked in overcoming some of those boundaries for people who kind of sit outside of those circles of decision making normally? Like what's been your experience? So what's an anecdote that you remember from some of those that stands out?
Okay, so let me share a few things. I think, yes, the jargon definitely is one of it. I think a lot of terms in the development space or philanthropy, people tend to just learn these terms and use them in their discussion, when they write proposals, or when they're pitching a concept or an idea, that they don't really take the time to understand why those terminologies exist or what that means for themselves or for their context of their work. And so definitely, I prefer to have like real simple language conversations and don't bring all this NGO terminology into the topic. Let's talk one-on-one like real people. And it almost feels sometimes like roboticized, like everyone has practiced this saying and saying things this way all the time. And so that's one bit. The other bit, I think, when it comes to philanthropy, is recognizing that there are differences in organizations, especially when you're from. So maybe I will talk about it in two ways. I will talk about it from a grassroots organization applying for funding or seeking funding, and from a donor perspective, being involved in a grant making process. And so I happen to have both perspectives because I spent, like you said when you introduced, I spent 9 years working in the development space with grassroots organizations across West Africa. And I have applied for so many grants and managed so many projects, and I've seen all of it, right? And I think that what works is when you have an organization that really cares and knows about how to make impact. Like really take the time to understand the issues and understand that change is not rushed. There's no 1 year project that or 2 years project that would achieve so much impact. You cannot have an engagement of an activity with like 5,000 people and expect that all those 5,000 people would suddenly change in an instant. That doesn't work. What really makes change happen is long-term systemic continuous engagement with a group of people, a small group of people. And that's what most local organizations miss. They are looking for quick wins and trying to pitch some big concept of a huge investment or a huge project that's going to reach 10,000s of people and multitudes of numbers. But really, the impact that each person gets is very minor. It's very minuscule. It really doesn't contribute much. And then from a funder's perspective, I think what has helped, especially for the Global Fund for Children, is that we have learned to not just base our engagement with organizations on the quality of what you write or what you propose on the documents that we receive. We really spend a lot of time, even before we fund an organization, getting to know the organization. So we always say that you don't find GFC finds you. And that is because our process involves a scouting process where we literally travel down to the country and meet the organization and see what you're doing and learn about your work and get to know you on a personal basis and see if you would be a fit. What we are trying to assess in that process is not just the legality or the structure or the system. There's not a capacity assessment. It's just getting to know the organization. It's getting to know how you work, what you do, how you exist, why you exist, and how much impact you're making. You might not have everything in place in terms of registration, bank accounts, policy documents, fancy systems and tools and monitoring evaluation, and all of that. We don't really pay attention to that when we're looking for organizations to work with. We really just care about organizations who are really making impact, and they're founded because they really want to work on the issues that they work on. And then we provide all of those additional capacity. And so the difference is in a conventional grant making process, you would have to write a very beautiful proposal. And maybe some organization might be doing a lot of amazing work, but they don't have the writing skills to package a very beautiful proposal or to write a concept note or to fill out those 10,000 pages grant applications. But it doesn't mean that their work is less of a quality. They're making real change in the small spaces that they're working on. And so that's where we have found that works when we're trying to be more, what's the word? Innovative in our grant making processes.
Thanks, Remy. Gail, do you want to go ahead? I know that you've got experiences here too.
That was really so interesting. Thank you. And I guess just to offer another answer, we agree that growth doesn't happen in isolation, right? And that sometimes isolation is created because of misunderstandings and we don't know how to define a word or a space. One of the things that we do early on is we play. And we're creative, and we might have a beginning activity in which it's outside of the conversation of philanthropy, but inside the conversation of relationship building. And maybe we throw a prompt out there for the people to talk about, maybe even in breakout groups, is, if you were up until 3 a.m. for any reason, whether you're old and have insomnia or you're young and working on a grant, and you needed to make some breakfast for yourself, what would you make? And that takes us in our heads, it takes us outside for a minute of this sort of heavy concept of, working together in philanthropy and understanding how we feed ourselves, right? How we feed ourselves at 3 a.m. And that can lead to some just different connections. And we try to do that all throughout our sessions early on. We go into the heaviness of the concept and then out of it into play. And I think all ages of people like to do that. They like to access that really creative, fun part of their brain, whether it's 80 years old or whether it's 25 years old.
I want to provoke a little bit for the two of you here. I mean, in some way that the two of you represent like the kind of almost the ideal, the kind of funders that everybody would want to come across, and that Valentina's comment in the chat, Remy, about this approach that GFF has of going to the place where people are and building those relationships with them. This is kind of how it should be. But a question for the two of you, like what's stopping other funders from doing this? What do you think is like the barriers in the way that the kind of more status quo funders go about their work? What is it that's preventing them from operating in this way as well? And feel free to speculate wildly on that one, because obviously we can't see inside people's heads, but what do you think?
I'll just jump in and say a couple of things that come to top of mind. I think what keeps people is just a misunderstanding about what their role is. If they think that they're coming to give approval, or if they think they're coming because they're going to say yes or no to a funding, I think understanding just like, why am I here? There's a little bit of fear that comes in, perhaps. That's one thing that comes to mind. What about you, Remy?
Sorry, technological issues as well. I think several things come to mind. Yeah, firstly, what you said, understanding the role that you play as a funder or a grant making organization, understanding that you're not there to dictate what people have to do or what their role is. You get the support, but the organization has more at stake than you do. Yes, your stake is the money you provide, and for them, it's more than that. It's so much more than that. It's your reputation, it's the impact, it's the lives of the people who are benefiting from your programs that is at stake. And so you have to recognize who has more to lose, and that should change the power dynamic. Because if I have more to lose, I should be more in control. I should have more say in decisions. I should be more involved in what is happening. So that's one part of it. The other part, I think, is a lot of funders recognizing the importance of capacity strengthening with local organizations, but oftentimes they're not ready for what that really entails. So using the same example of our scouting process, it doesn't end. It's a continuous process. I'm literally in the office of one of our partners at the moment for the same purpose. And not every funder is going to be accessible as much as we can be. Also because one of the lessons that we have learned at GFC that has made this for us easier is that we learn to decentralize our team. We cannot always just be in an office somewhere, maybe in the Western world or in some headquarters in Africa, and send all the grants to organizations. We needed to make sure we have team members that were within the regions where our partners. So we have structures where we have people who work remotely for the most, but also are available on the ground with the organizations that we support in every region. And so we spend a lot of time getting to know them, building those relationships, and being there to provide the guidance, mentorship. And sometimes it's just literally just being a sounding board that we can call you up and say, oh, we're thinking about running this program. And we wanted to discuss it with you. What do you think? What ideas do you have? And you just provide a space for them to talk freely. Sometimes it's also recognizing that they can learn from one another. So what we do also is to create the interconnection between different organizations where they can talk to each other and build a relationship outside of me and as a funder leading that place. And so we put them in a cohort where they can interact with one another and learn from one another and support each other with their initiatives. And that also works. Another thing that I think comes to mind in creating this world of philanthropy being more accessible is also recognizing that there is, like Gail said, there is a misunderstanding, there's a difference. There's been a lot of talk recently over the last couple of years, flexible funding and localization, participatory grants. But I think that sometimes the funders are saying one thing and the grassroots organizations are saying something different. And there's a misunderstanding in those ways. For example, when I say flexible funding from a local organization, that would sound like free money. Hey, we can take this money and do whatever we want. But what funders mean is that flexible funding means I don't have to dictate what you need to do with the money. You should be able to invest that in programs that make sense to achieve the impact that you're working for. But I've seen grassroots organizations who will get flexible funding and decide to invest their money in buying a vehicle or building a huge office space so they can have their name on the building, but not really investing in their programs or in the initiatives that they are running to impact the lives of children and young people that they work with. And so that's one aspect to it, and also, yes, it's not free money. It's also the flexible funding cannot exist in isolation. It always has to go with capacity strengthening. So providing the funding without all these comprehensive restrictions and requirements, but being available to provide long-term, on-the-ground, tailored capacity strengthening support to these organizations to really help them amplify their impact. Sometimes it also involves supporting organizations with the things that funders would naturally buying a generator to keep your lights on, or paying staff who are not directly working on this initiative, but require their support in one way or the other to keep the organization running, or investing in buying assets like computers and printers and all of these things, and also maybe being able to direct that investment in ways that you think is necessary for you. Maybe supporting them with traveling for conferences. And these are things that GFC is willing to provide. Not necessarily because we think it's the best use of your money or because we just want to give free money around, but because we believe that, and I've seen organizations who really don't invest in themselves, but they're putting all their budgets into the implementation of programs, but not really about themselves. And that's also another component that adds to it. I think I've spoken too long. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, wouldn't it be fun to have an activity in which the different generations got together and even, before any conversation of philanthropy, there was a creation of a glossary of terms. Like, let's come up with our own glossary of terms, much like, building off what Remy says, like, okay, this group, or put people together of different generations and say, what's your definition of flexible funding? What's yours? It's like, oh my gosh, they're both so different, or they're both the same. And then maybe create a whole new term. Maybe flexible funding goes away and it's some other new term.
Well, while we're talking about language, there's a great question in the chat, and I'm going to start picking some of these out as well because they're more interesting than the questions that I was going to ask. But there's a question there around language, this idea of weaving language across the generations. So on the one hand, we have that language of the colonial roots of philanthropy as it's come out of the West. On the other hand, Remy, as you touched on, there's a whole life and generations of philanthropy built around cultures everywhere. And so when we talk about creating that shared language, do you see that as something that is almost like a 50-50, like we keep the language of theories of change and outputs, activities, outcomes, that kind of that professional jargon, and then mix in some of the language that basically normal people use to talk about trying to get change? Or should we more deliberately shift it towards that, as Mohini said, the liberatory history of philanthropy? And yeah, how do the two of you see that? Both of you spoken about this language barrier that is set up by the system as well.
I love the idea of creating a new language. I think it'd be super interesting, super, powerful and compelling. I think it's what needs to happen. And I think it's the kind of project that, long-term, my dream would be is that this new vocabulary would completely take the place of the old, and then systems like governments, the Internal Revenue Service, for Pete's sake, right? All these, organizations out there that are pressing down on this systemic change, they'd have to adopt a new vocabulary. That's a long-term vision. That's a North Star. But I think having a new, whoever knew you would use Zoom as a word, right? Then we had to just keep practicing it this way versus the way maybe I grew up with it when I was using my camera or something. I love the idea of a new language.
Absolutely. I love the idea, but to add to it, I think while we work and create a world where we have a unified language that is simpler and that everybody can use and is not too jargony, maybe we need to start recognizing currently that sometimes we have to intentionally see beyond the jargon. We have to go beyond just what is written, and that's what we can do now while we work to create a world with less jargon. Yeah.
I want to throw to you another question in the chat. Another kind of like that one that really gets to the foundations of this as well. So what do you feel the role of philanthropy is in creating new worlds where all life belongs? So i.e. like that transformational aspect of philanthropy versus when philanthropy just tries to, you know, fix something through a project, a 1-year project, a 3-year project, or and basically just continues the status quo because it's just something that happens, and then the grant is made, a report comes in, a grant is made, a report comes in, versus like that real transformational aspect. Have either of you experienced or seen examples of when it's that much more transformational change that we all kind of desire deep down?
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to tell a bit of a story first before I come to my conclusion. So one of the strategies that some of our partners in West Africa are using with their initiative is a community-led approach. And the community-led approach is basically this idea of working with villages or rural communities for a long time, for minimum 3 years. And in those 3 years, you go to a village where majority of the people have no access to education, there's no electricity, they don't speak English, they don't have clean water, typical African village, right? And you go there and you spend 3 years with them and provide empowering education through on a series of different topics, from human rights to gender to literacy, numeracy, a comprehensive curriculum. And while you're doing that, you support the community to develop a vision for how they want your community to look like in maybe 5 years. And they develop this vision board, and also accompanying the vision board is a list of values of how they want to live in that community for the next 5 years. And this is then becomes their community vision. And then they look at the entire vision board and identify which ones can they achieve by themselves without any external support, whether an NGO, a donor, or as a community, as a village. And then they pick out something and take their time to plan it because they're used to planning things on their own. They plan weddings, they plan birthday parties, they cook their food, they invite their guests, and they have their beautiful celebrations without any external support. And so they invest that time and energy into solving one of their problems, whatever it is that they identify and prioritize. And then they achieve that. And that instantly ignites this mindset within the community that they can lead their own development. And this approach has been super impactful. And we learned this from an organization in Senegal, Postan, because they have spent 30 years developing this model. And they center their entire work, their framework on well-being and the concept of well-being for individuals, well-being for community, and understanding that well-being comes in different dimensions, from economic health, mental, social, physical, you name it. And how do you differentiate it in a way that you are able to empower everyone to achieve their own definition of well-being in all dimensions? That is the foundation of their work. And now to answer your question, I think that philanthropy should be centered on well-being. Well-being should be the framework of how development works. The only way we can create a world all these different animals and people can exist is if it's a world that's centered on well-being, where everyone has the tools, the necessities, the education, the resources to achieve their own well-being. And then philanthropy maybe would not need to exist at that point.
Oh, let's see. Gosh, it's just a big question. And I love talking about this question about, you know, whether big, holistic, transformational change is the way to go or project-based. And I have to say that though I think and talk about this a lot, I'm still not fully clear if it's an either or if it's a both. I just don't know that yet. And I think that there are some funders who will only just have this lens of, I want my name to be big, I want my impact to be big, I want to get recognition, I want to make a big splash. And then there's others who are, I think, gradually learning, and in part, I want to say through some of the work that we do, that incremental change, project by project, can also be an important way to get to, a jumping off point. So I think one of the things that could be talked about in these intergenerational groups could be to understand and unpack a little bit more what different generations think is a project. And if that's is that a scaled thing? Do you have something that was now going to be transformational, or does everything have to get a star, right? This glossary could also include forms of, levels of understanding about a concept. A concept may not have one definitive answer, but there could be levels of understanding it. And then organizations and foundations could take it back and say, wow, we really understand this level really well, but we don't understand that other level about what happens if a motorcycle is purchased for someone, right? And what that could rev up to, so to speak. So I'm not sure if I'm fully clear if it's one or the other, and I would hope that it could be a combination of both.
Thanks to you both. There's a set of questions, about 3 or 4 of them in the chat, that are kind of like floating around the same topic, which is this kind of this catch-22 that exists for many small organizations or organizations led by young people. So you don't have enough funds or income to be able to justify getting a grant, in which case you can't increase your funds in order to get a grant, or you're from an area that's further away from the networks that are happening, or a funder decides it wants to fund groups of organizations rather than one, so another door kind of closes. For organizations or young people who find themselves with the kind of that feeling of those doors closing in front of them, and not being able to find one that's knocking on the doors but that aren't opening, what's your advice? And that advice could be very practical, because I think the two of you, your knowledge of that wider sector and those opportunities that are out there would be of great use to everybody in this room as well. Or maybe what's your more kind of personal advice? But what would your words be to those people and organizations that find themselves in that kind of catch-22?
Go ahead, Remy. I still have to think that through a little bit.
It's the same with me. I also have to think about it, but off the top of my head, I would say 2 things. I think one is, from your perspective as an organization who is in such a situation, is to intentionally create ways that people can see people. This could be, say, for example, you have an initiative, and at the end of the initiative, you intentionally invite as many persons as you can to come see what you're doing. It might not be that they would instantly fund you, but people will get to know that you exist and know your work. It could be using social media, and maybe a Facebook or a website, if you have access to those resources. But you have to actively find ways to be seen. It's difficult when you are working in such remote locations and nobody knows that you're there and nobody can find you. And so on the other side, I think for funders, it's taking the responsibility to prioritize organizations or nations who oftentimes do not get access to this funding. And I think that's one of the things that we do at GFC, no matter in rather small ways, because there are so many organizations that are in the same situation, but we cannot fund everyone, we cannot engage everyone. But we intentionally try to find those organizations. And the only ways we can find them is if someone somewhere knows or has an idea or has said something about you. We would be intentional about finding you when we go for startup. And that's what I got.
So I'm going to do one of these sort of generational things here. Can you repeat the question?
Sure, it was quite a rambling question. I apologize as well. So a lot of organizations, especially those that have been set up and run by young people, find themselves in that situation where they're unable to get funding because maybe they're in a location that's much more remote and no one knows about them, or they haven't got enough funding in the first place in order to be able to apply for more funding. So it's that kind of situation where instead of doors of opportunity opening, they all seem to be closed, and it can get very frustrating and dispiriting. Yeah. So what would be your words of advice, Gail? Like practical, emotional advice, or any type?
Yeah, it's just such an important question, and I hear it often. And I'm not sure if I'm in a position to say specifically what to do, but one thing that I've noticed can be helpful in those conversations is having, a group of people, like let's say you're one of the Little Big Fun Big Believers, and we come together every month and we have conversations just like this, or we have a guest speaker come in one of our convenings. And in the process of having those conversations, much like we're doing today, there can be a lot of answers. I would suggest, rather than rely on what my advice might be, is to have a collaborative conversation, talk to your peers, talk to others, just keep asking the question. And I don't mean to be dismissive, because I understand it's really important, but I don't feel I'm qualified to say exactly what to do. It's kind of a process of exploration. And I guess it's always unlearning, but learning at the same time. And I'm happy to be a part of those continued conversations with anyone.
Just to add a few things before you come, I think also there might be some reality check that you need to face. First of all, before you think about getting access to funding, be sure that you're doing good work. I've seen a lot of grassroots organizations that are working in remote areas, but when you get to know the work that you're doing, they really aren't doing much. It's usually, most of the time, I've seen too many of them, that's why I have to say it. You'll find young people who started organizations thinking that, oh, this could be a way to make money. And get access to funding, not really caring about doing any work or really making impact in the communities. And so I think whatever change you make, whatever progress, you should strive to make your impact speak for you. I don't know if you can still hear me.
You were breaking up a bit, Remy, but sorry, Gail. But sorry, I think the key you got the key message, Remy, like impact first, and then start thinking about funding and money. Sorry, Gail, go on.
I was just going to say, I would love to hear from you, Remy, how you would define the good work, because maybe that's a question that comes up for someone when they're in this catch-22 and they're confused because this funder says this. But so then I think it is important to come back to good work. But then again, this would be an interesting conversation for me to say, like, to the funder or to the social impact change maker, what is good work, right? And it could change from time to time and conversation to conversation. What do you define as good work?
That's a great point. For me, when I say good work, I don't really mean that you should have the most impact. What I really look out for, especially when I go scouting, is that you have a clear understanding of what the problem is that you're trying to work, and you have an approach of how you're working on the problem. That's just it. You should have an approach. It shouldn't be, oh yeah, we're here, we're helping teenage mothers. But what really is the problem, and how are you working on it? Yeah, it's okay to be responding to situations, and that is in itself good work. But be clear what your real problem is and how you're working on it. If you don't have a clear approach, if you don't have a clear understanding of your work, it's difficult to find a rationale for someone to support you when they don't understand what you're working. And so you don't understand what you're working. That's what I mean.
Yeah, that's great. That's helpful. That's an example of how we could not connect if I didn't fully understand what your definition is. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you both. My agenda is flashing at me and it says I should start handing back to Eri any minute now. But before I do, Gail, Remy, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I hope everybody in the room who put in questions in the chat, I hope I voiced most of them, if not all of them, and apologies if I missed them. I think for me, the really key recommendation that somebody made was to use the knowledge garden to create this this new glossary of terms. And I think also Gail and Remy, if you have, and myself as well, if we have practical links or tips or anything else that we can put in there as well, I'm sure. And I'm looking at Youth by Youth people to nod if I say this, but that's the place to put them as well as resources to put them to grow in the knowledge garden as well. Yes. But thank you both for and for giving your time and your wisdom and your experience for this group, and for on behalf of all three of us for inviting us into this space as well. I know that it's been a privilege to be here as well. But thank you to you both. And Eri, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I mean, time just really flies. It just felt like we shouldn't end this conversation, but I'm very sure that this is just the beginning. One of the reasons we do this is to also catalyze, this conversation. So please share resources. Let's keep talking about it. And for everyone who has registered for this session, you'll most likely get a follow-up email and message about the next steps. So thank you so much to all the organizations, to all the funders, to our adult allies, and to everyone who has been a part of this. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much, Nathan. Thank you so much, Gail. And thank you so much, Remy. I mean, I just want to say that I'm currently a fellow at the Little Big Fun Fellow, which is also an intergenerational way of training younger organizations on how to access funding. So I think some of these things are already getting in play bit by bit. So I just want to mention next steps for us who for organizations here who are probably thinking of how to get intergenerational. So there is something in there's a program we have in Youth by Youth called the Weavership. And that's a process of working in intergenerational collabs to create programs together to be more youth-centered. So if you are thinking, oh, are we youth-centered? Are we youth-focused? Should we be moving towards young people? Or how should we go about this? Then maybe you should register to host a weaver. So by hosting a weaver or by registering your organization, you get to have a weaver, a young person work with you for a period of 8 months to reimagine your programs and look at your programs to see if genuinely they are intergenerational or they consider young people. So please do well to register so that we can match you with a young person that might be interested in your work. So I think I like what Val is saying here. Get intergenerational. Yes, that should be on our next chat. Well, yes, thank you so much everyone for joining. And I see some of our partners on this call also. It's so good to have everyone here. I don't want to mention many names, but it's so good to see you and so many other people. So the checkout right now is because it's very important that we keep in mind the lessons from this session. So our checkout is write a note to yourself about what you want to remember from this session and drop one sentence in the chat. What is that one thing you want to write to yourself, for that you want to remember from this? I know we said a lot of things, but what is one thing you want to remember, from this session? Drop that one sentence in the chat. All right. I'm gonna play music as we do that.
And Ron, before we play the music between now and the next session, please stay with us to just reflect on what you've learned today. We're going to have a very short 10 to 15 minute session where we take a time to reflect on what we've learned, what we've heard, what's resonated with us, and a reflection on this key question of the day. What do we need to face? And also reflect a little bit on our intention for tomorrow. So thank you so much, and hope that you stay with us for this last bit of day one.